welcome to our very first, very first middle lecture of the year. Yes, we cannot have you before. It is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Sessa, who, look up your webpage, who you actually are. Tina is a very old friend of mine. And I know her work extremely well, and sometimes one has to actually get it all in order. Tina is here to speak to us her latest project, or her current project, on late antiquity, but she already has a long trajectory of wonderful, stellar, and important work in the field of late antiquity. So Tina did her PhD at Berkeley, and that dissertation came out in 2012, and it's, with Cambridge University Press, the formation of papal authority in late antique Italy, Roman bishops, and the domestic sphere, and it kind of encapsulates Tina's interest in, I would say, a combination of people, institution, and social practice at the end of antiquity, and how that intersects with the very kind of complicated political history of that era in which the Roman Empire ended. And in that book, she looked at it through the lens of the Roman bishop and the growth of the authority of the Roman bishop, very much rooted in antiquity and domestic discourse and so on. And then she published an amazing book, which you should all read, called Daily Life in Late Antiquity, which was a trailblazing project because no one had done this before.
I've written daily life books before, but not
late antiquity. Yeah. And that's amazing because late antiquity is usually looked at for political history and all the kind of change in on the macro level. So it's really, really good to have some kind of micro historical approach. What did this really feel like, or did it feel like anything? Did it matter to people that this massive empire ended? And she's currently at work on this project on disaster, and in the process has transformed herself as the foremost critical scholar of environmental history in late antiquity, which is also extremely welcome because lots of things are going on in environmental history. The late antiquity was also a period of major disasters like plague and climate change, or not. People think that,
yes,
but
it's always changing.
Yes, it's always changing. Some people make massive claims, and it's always good to go back to the sources and see what's actually happening, which is exactly what Tina is doing. And we're getting an aspect of that work for us, luckily associated with human dependency, because that's what we're actually doing in the cluster. So I'll finish there, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. That is a lovely introduction. And let me put my glasses on. Let me start by first of all thanking Jan Hubert, who did all of this gut work to bring me here. And I will say that I was supposed to come last spring, and then I had some issues and I couldn't make it, and he very kindly and patiently rescheduled me, and I really appreciate all of that. And a huge thank you to my dear friend Julia Hilner, who is an inspiration for me in my own work. And whenever I do anything with legal history, I do it with great trepidation at what Julia might say. So I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to your feedback and to all of your feedback. I should say, this is a project that is by no means finished. I'm still drafting chapters, and so I really do honestly look for your feedback and your comments and questions. I'm at a place where things are still coming together. So for my talk today, I'll present some ongoing research about disasters in late antiquity. And I'm currently working on a book that I'm, at the moment, calling After Disaster, which is a cultural and material history of human responses to sudden large-scale ruinous events, both natural and human-made. And the dating here is between the 3rd and the 7th centuries CE. I'll say more in a minute about what I mean by disaster, that word, and how I use it. But I consider everything from an urban siege to an earthquake. My project focuses on historical disasters, not imagined or futuristic scenarios that appear, for example, in apocalyptic literature. This is because I'm especially interested in the reflective and responsive phases of this history, how people coped with the aftermath, and how those who survived catastrophes handled their fear, displacement, property loss, bodily harm, and social disruption. Consequently, my project does not aim to determine why disasters happened in any realistic sense, though when relevant, I do use archaeological and paleoscientific scholarship for current theories on possible causal conditions. Nor, and this is probably the most important sort of statement to make, nor do I seek to explain what disasters did to the Roman Empire on a metastructural level. This is not another story of decline or resilience, for that matter. I'm not making a case for societal impacts across time and space. And there is no shortage of these kinds of studies. And I just left a few, including our friend Mishmar, a bunch of them up here that can give you, if you're interested in that approach, that is an approach that has been taken quite frequently. And all of these scholars are coming from slightly different places. Not all are using environmental research or evidence. The Harper is the one that does that, as well as the Plague book at the end. So while I view the ancient and medieval Mediterranean through the lens of continuity, the music does indeed go on, I would argue. I fear the resilience model popularized of late encourages us to look past, and let me just give you an example of those. I fear that the resilience model popularized of late encourages us to look past the often horrific experiences of those caught up in an earthquake, plague, or urban siege. In focusing on the continuous longue durée, I think we miss opportunities to explore how the major structural changes that characterize the late Roman Empire, so these would be political fragmentation, economic contraction, increased armed violence, and the rise of the Christian church, to name what I would say are the big four, how they inflected this experience, these experiences of living with disaster. Alternatively, my study centers the humans who lived with and through these disasters. I'm interested in how they experienced large-scale, materially ruinous phenomena, how they wrote about them, how they explained them, how they did or did not survive them, and how they grieved and remembered them. My arguments also rest on the observation that disasters are phenomenologically different from more ordinary entanglements of human and non-human, and that they bring us to places where more routine crises do not. At this point, I should probably clarify what I mean by disaster, and more importantly, how my late Roman actors understood it. The English word disaster is Latinate in its roots, but these roots are late medieval. When Occitan or maybe Italian writers coined the phrase disastere or disastro to refer to calamity, misfortune, and specifically to the state of being ill-starred. That's what disaster really means ill-starred. Nevertheless, I think many late Romans would have recognized disaster in a way similar to the medievals who first coined the term, a bad situation born out of a particular set of shifting intersections between cosmic and earthly contexts. Personal misfortune and the idea that one's life was entwined with fate were well known to late ancient men and women who expressed such truisms in words like mala and causus or kappa and supra, the Latin and the Greek, most plainly translated as evils or misfortunes. Additionally, Misha Meyer suggests that Greek authors strongly associated the concept of suffering, athema, with disaster. This more effective semantics appears in Latin authors too, indicating that what we would call disasters were universally associated with painful endurance. For the most part, however, I find from my own research and word searches that Romans gravitated towards a more concrete language to denote events such as wars, pandemics, or earthquakes. employing a range of Latin or Greek words whose most basic meaning was destruction or ruin in the material sense, along, of course, with a more precise vocabulary that denotes specific hazards. And I've given you the more precise terms. The first list are words in Latin and Greek for pestilence, for disease. The fame and limos is famine, and then the bottom obviously is earthquakes. Saying this, late Romans were deeply invested in examining how material destruction was socially experienced. Authors relied heavily on classical and biblical paradigms of disaster to tell their stories about urban sieges, earthquakes, and pandemics. These paradigms are heavily formulaic and trade in what can feel like tired cliches. If anyone's ever read a description of an urban siege, you've read the same description over and over again. In fact, classicists even have a term they call the urbs capta motif. And there's a strong interest in using particular kinds of rhetorical tools. Energeia is one that is the use of language to create a kind of sensorial experience of something with words, particularly visual. These paradigms, nevertheless, they routinely underline the social dimensions of a materially ruinous event, even though they use cliches. The screaming women whose babies are torn from their breasts, the lines of captives marched out of the city, the swift breakdown of social order after an earthquake, the secession of sacred family rites like the burial of the dead during the pandemic. These are tropes that appear in disaster narratives across Mediterranean literature, from the account of the siege of Jerusalem in First Kings to Thucydides' plague narrative, and they consequently structure late ancient writing. Their inclusion suggests that our pre-modern disaster narrative would have agreed, at least in part, with modern scholars in the field of disaster studies, who theorized disaster not as, and I should make a slide for this, we already had this morning, who theorized disaster not as an exogenous hazard, so something that happens like from outside to the community, but rather as a socially constructed process. In this literature, disasters are the expression of damage as mediated by contingent material and social conditions, including variables like race, class, and gender. So the question that people in disaster studies always ask is, disaster for whom? Or in the case of resilience, resilience for whom? The assumption is that disaster, because it is socially mediated, is always differentially experienced. And that's a really key insight. And I actually think even though my late Roman observers rarely talk about social differentiation, I mean, they do, but rarely in the way that people who are disaster scholars talk about it. I do think their accounts, when read for both inclusions and silences, reveal a wide range of experiences that were nonetheless shaped by pre-existing social and cultural and political structures. So my book is divided into 5 chapters, each focusing on a different perspective and or scale of human response to disaster in late antiquity. And I should say this is a Mediterranean-wide project. I don't read Syriac, but I do try to work with people who do use some Syriac sources, but I'm using Greek and Latin. My comfort zone still remains the Latin West, and you'll see that today when I give my talk. The rest of my material it's more West than East, but I am trying to. So what I want to do today is present material from chapter 4, which examines the immediate material and social impacts of a sudden ruinous event. What kinds of damage did they create, and what were their acute social impacts on directly affected communities? The short answer to the second part of this question is displacement. Just before, during, and directly after disasters, people were typically forced to leave their homes and in some cases to move permanently away. Displacement in disaster during late antiquity is best understood along a spectrum, ranging from a brief temporary relocation on one end to permanent removal and enslavement on the other. It's a really wide spectrum. I suspect that for many late Romans caught up in a disaster, especially with those with fewer resources and only maybe local connections, displacement was especially terrifying, precisely because it could lead not only to the abrupt breaking of familial bonds, for example, but also, and this is important, I think, to the forced making of considerably less familiar and more volatile connections. As archaeologist Catherine Cameron, and she's works in mostly the Americas, argues in her global study of pre-modern captivity, displacement is typically experienced as sequences of fissure and fusion, wherein social and emotional bonds are broken and made under conditions of extreme duress. And I find her insights for my own project goals to be really helpful, because I am particularly interested in understanding how late Romans up and down the social ladder responded to displacement. How did they respond to this kind of sequence of fissure and fusion? So to kind of get into the material, I want to start with a story from Procopius's Wars, a 6th century account of Justinian's wars of reconquest in the Western Mediterranean. I was assuming that not everybody in the room would know anything about this. And so just to kind of situate everybody, the Gothic War was part of this much broader campaign of Justinian to retake some of the land in the territory in the Western Mediterranean that had fallen under the control of non-Roman barbarian regimes, and to, through military force, reconnect that back into the empire. And some of it didn't take them very long, some of it took a long time. It all took a long time, and it was mostly a failure, I should say, in the long term. But the attempt to retake back Ostrogothic Italy was a nearly 25-year war. It was a really long, 20-year. It was a very long, prolonged campaign. And so, just to give you some dates, Procopius, who's the author of the text that I'm going to show you guys in a second, he wrote a couple of different things, but he wrote a very lengthy narrative of these wars of reconquest. We call it just the wars. He was also a kind of on-the-ground participant. He was the advisor to one of the generals, Belisarius, and accompanied him during certain campaigns in the Gothic. So Procopius is a really cool source because he was there, and he can actually give us, something like a highly mediated eyewitness experience, but it's good for that. So that's who we are. And I'll mention Alaric in a minute. He comes up in the text. Alaric was a much earlier figure, you can see, and some of you know he was a military leader of a band of Goths and other people who, among other things, marched on the city of Rome and sieged the city of Rome in 410. And so he was in Italy in the late 4th century, I guess, with his army. That's the key thing to know. Okay. What follows is a digression from the Gothic War. In the summer of 538, while accompanying Roman forces on an inland march north towards Osimo in the province of Picenum, Procopius passed through the city of Urbisalia. What he encountered sounded a lot like an American ghost town, replete with rubble and myths. Alaric, he explained, had destroyed Urbisalia so completely in the previous century that, quote, nothing whatever remains of its former adornments, except a small remnant of a single gate and the floor of the adjoining edifice. Stranger still is the story he tells about the city's more recent history during the Gothic War. According to Procopius, when the Roman army had swept through Picenum a few months earlier, the inhabitants of Urbisalia had fled, uncertain about how imperial forces would treat them. In their flight, they left behind absolutely everything, including, we are told, a tiny infant still in its swaddling clothes. The child's mother, Procopius surmises, was either killed or taken captive, since she never returned. When the abandoned baby cried out in the empty city, its wails were met by a sheep-goat, who, as it happened, had just given birth. The goat suckled and protected the infant, taking the human child as its own. Later, those Urbisalians who had not been captured, killed, or otherwise permanently displaced returned to their city and discovered the infant's miraculous survival. Women rushed to offer the baby their own breasts, but neither the child nor the goat would have it. The infant, Procopius explained, quote, would not have anything to do with human milk, nor was the goat willing to let it go. The curious bond between animal and human was so intense and long-lasting that it became a curiosity. When Procopius himself personally visited Urbisalia, the citizens pinched the child to demonstrate the fierce maternal response by the goat to its crush. The goat would come over and protect it. Whether true story or tall tale, the digression invites reflection on the exigencies of disasters like warfare and its impact on social connection, especially the ways in which dependency can be unmade and then remade during periods of acute disruption. Equally arresting are the many silences and suppositions that Procopius weaves into the narrative. What precisely happened to the mother, and why did she not return? Was she taken captive, sold into slavery, and dragged far from Italy? Or did she manage to survive somewhere as a refugee? The story, with its arresting details and problematic gaps, is a great launching pad for thinking about displacement as a highly gendered sequence of fissure and fusion. It also requires us to consider the disaster experiences of the sub-elite, people who were not originally destitute, but who weren't members of a well-connected aristocracy. So, to be sure, human mobility was a key feature of the ancient Mediterranean, and there were high levels of connectivity in late antiquity, as in earlier periods. The Roman Empire had long worked to regulate mobility to some degree, with most energy spent on fixing people in place, as the work of Claudia Moatti and Elena Messiah have shown. It's also the case that warfare was among the most significant triggers of forced movement in pre-modern times, and this is perhaps transhistorical. The fact that late antiquity was especially chaotic in terms of internal conflict, be it from civil unrest or external conquest, is thus important to keep in mind. But none of this means that what happened in Urbisalia in 538 or in 410 for that matter wasn't a disaster. Although the conflict that dispersed the Urbisalians at least twice in their late ancient history is in some ways typical for the period, the experiences of displacement recorded by Procopius and the other late Roman witnesses are anything but everyday, even if they are not unexpected. For the remainder, I'll focus on two late Roman forms of displacement, starting with provisional definitions. First, I want to look at people forced to move suddenly and seek security elsewhere, but whose movement is on a certain level voluntary. We might call these people refugees. Second, I'll talk about people taken captive by others and moved elsewhere on a wholly involuntary basis. I thus put aside other attested late ancient types of displacement, notably exile, which as a form of individual legal punishment strikes me as a different kind of experience from what the people in Urbisalia suffered in 538. So since I'm sitting next to the expert in late antique exile, we can add some stuff to that. After a little ground clearing, I'll use Procopius's digression about the missing Urbisalian mother to explore different paths that non-elite women might have encountered as they negotiated the chaos of forced movement in a conflict. So let me begin with some theoretical observations about the challenges of finding displaced people in late ancient sources. Scholars in the field of modern refugee studies have long warned about the dangers of positing a generalized refugee as a kind of transhistorical naturalized personhood. As anthropologist Lisa Malky reminds us, the refugee did not exist as a distinct social or legal category until after World War II, when it became an internationally recognized status, along with other statuses like internally displaced person. In both cases, the modern concern is with the definition of political rights and issues of membership or non-membership in modern nation states. But in late antiquity, displacement and disaster was for the most part not a problem of political belonging and statehood. I'm not saying it couldn't be, but most of the time it was. And consequently, perhaps, late Romans did not have Greek or Latin conceptual equivalents for the modern English refugee, at least not in terms of a universally recognized legal status or category of persons. Now, the word refugee is itself etymologically related to the Latin refugium, which is a word referring to a legally protected space for certain kinds of fugitives. It's the equivalent of asylum. But I think this is about a set of conditions that are, again, quite different from what I'm trying to get at. To understand how late Romans did conceptualize forced movement by disaster, Consider the following law issued by Honorius's court in Ravenna in 408 CE. And this, by the way, was almost certainly in response to the movement of Alaric's army through northern Italy and Illyria, which is it's basically where modern Yugoslavia is. Okay, so let me just read this. Now, what's up there now is a part of this law that as we have it. And this is from Farr's translation, for those who can. When an incursion of barbarians was expected throughout parts of Illyricum, and Illyricum, again, is this area that is between Italy and Greece, so it's the modern Yugoslavia, a numerous band of inhabitants sought homes elsewhere. But the persistent greed of petitioners is accustomed to make assaults against the freeborn status of these persons and illicitly seeks to impose upon them the yoke of slavery. Therefore, your sublimity shall recognize that we have prescribed that no person shall be permitted to petition for any Illyrian who either lives in his homeland or who has been received by any other land whatsoever. Now, the legislation clearly describes the displacement of Illyrians from their homes to other parts of the region, as well as outside it. Their movement, moreover, is presented as simultaneously willed under duress, right? They're anticipating these forces coming and they want to get out before they get captured or worse. But it conveys their forced movement paraphrastically rather than through a single label noting them as refugees. And I'll stop doing that, but you know I'm putting that in quotes. The Illyrians are in the law called incola, a word that in the earlier period, the Republic, could mean resident alien. It's kind of the Latin equivalent for medic. But here, I think it simply connotes a resident. Had the court been interested in underscoring the Illyrians' territorial dislocation, they might have used a word such as aduena or even peregrinus, a term which can mean stranger or foreigner, or in a more technical sense, a person from another city or province. But the court didn't use these words, likely because it didn't associate this modality of forced moving under duress within the empire in anticipation of depredation from barbarian enemies with any recognized category of person. From the state's perspective, the Illyrians weren't foreigners or wanderers, even if they moved outside their patria. Alternatively, the category of personhood that the state does explicitly recognize is the Illyrian people's freeborn status, that word ingenuitas, which was evidently under threat. It appears that unnamed opportunists, and whether these were Romans or other barbarians, the law doesn't say, were taking advantage of the displaced Illyrians' vulnerability by forcing them into slavery. And they even had the gall to petition when the Illyrians pushed back. So that whole thing is about telling people you can't go to court and demand that this person stay your slave because this person should never be your slave to begin with because this person's reformed. But the state does not give these vulnerable displaced persons any special status nor place any restrictions on them. They simply do not see them as refugees like we do. While the late Roman imperial court didn't recognize the refugee as a category of persons, we might have expected Christian authorities to have done so. After all, this is the precise period when the church begins to define the poor as a distinct category of persons whom Christians had a moral responsibility to assist. And this is just to the top are some of the recent, well, maybe not recent studies about the poor as a category of persons in late antiquity within Christian discourses. As Wendy Mayer notes, the classical and biblical dictum to welcome strangers was also a Christian virtue. Surely this would suggest that the stranger, if not the refugee, also constituted a universally legible subaltern group in the early Christian moral economy. But alas, did not, as Mayer observes in the case of Greek sources from the Eastern Mediterranean, and I can confirm regarding Latin work in the West. Like the legal evidence, Christian sources frequently describe people displaced far from their homes through ruinous events, most commonly by warfare, but also by earthquakes or plagues. Some, such as the letters of the Roman bishop Gelasius, even describe groups of displaced persons flocking to Rome in search of security and resources, while the Gallo-Roman bishop and former Roman urban prefect Sidonius Apollinaris recounts how a local landowner transported large numbers of starving locals onto his property during a regional famine when he offered them food and shelter. But there's no consistent vocabulary in the evidence to suggest a formal conceptualization of these people as refugees. In short, the refugee does and does not exist in late antiquity. She is there, but not in the same way that she is visible to us today, or perhaps in other times and places. Now, in contrast to the difficulty of finding refugees, captives and captivity appear with great clarity in the Greco-Roman sources. Because of its long history of conquest and common existence of prisoners of war, the Roman state worked to define the socio-legal state of the socio-legal status of the captive, as well as the conditions of its return. And I use the male pronoun here deliberately because the Roman legal concept governing captivity and return, as the term is the Latin term is jus post liminium, was first created for men, specifically male soldiers captured by enemy forces. The laws and legal opinions on jus post liminium define a sequence of conditional situations whereby captured soldiers lose their citizenship status and all its attendant rights. But once ransomed and or returned to Roman territory, they regain all of these rights, actually everything but their marriages, interestingly. There nevertheless were inherent ambiguities in the system, such as the fact that captured POWs hovered somewhere between free and unfree and were often illicitly sold into slavery, which is obviously something you saw being hinted at with the Illyrians earlier. I mean, hinted at, it's stated in the law we just looked at. The changing geopolitical realities of the late Roman Empire, notably the fact that virtually all warfare was internal and mostly in the form of civil conflict, troubled a system largely created in an earlier epoch of foreign territorial conquest. One good but imperfect indicator that captivity was increasingly a problem for the late Roman state is the rise in extant legislation on captivity starting in the late 3rd century, much of which aimed at tweaking extant rules. So there have been rules about this in laws for a long time, but there's a lot more of them and they get much more they change in later. And in these laws, we find, for example, hostes, enemies, which used to refer to like the enemies from some other people, get redefined as barbarians. We also see a more dogged attempts to resolve the cascade of legal problems that captivity and return engendered for property-owning Roman citizens, civilians of all ages, male and female. And the laws are now specific that women too are in this context. We also find the clearest attempt in Roman legal history to define, that we can argue, to define the relationship between the ransomed and the ransom. It's a law issued by Honorius, it's the one on the slide, in 408 from Ravenna. This is the same year and as the legislation about the displaced Illyrians that reiterates the tenets of post liminium. It forbids Romans from suing returning captives for expenditures of food and clothing during their journey home. In other words, people who were trying to get back and would give them food and other things wanted them to get paid back by the escaping captive. And again, this law reminds us that every disaster is somebody's opportunity. And most importantly, that declares anyone directly, quote unquote, from a barbarian vendor, quis barbaris vendentibus emisae, must work for their ransomer until the debt is paid off for up to 5 years. Put another way, the ransomed captive, unable to repay the sum of her ransom upon immediately, upfront, falls into a relationship of debt bondage with her ransomer. And by the way, this law was created to encourage people to ransom. This was not meant to protect the person being ransomed. This law was in there to make it worth it to you to try to ransom people back. And I should say, too, the idea of the ransomed body as collateral, this is not new romantic. This clearly pre-exists. The law also singles out the role of Christian priests, quote, who hold the churches of the neighboring and localities nearest in mediating a ransomed captive's return. Here, Honorius's court formalizes what had long been an informal but nevertheless self-recognized role of Christian clergy to ransom captives. As Carolyn Oswiak and William Klingshirn and many others have shown, ancient clerics, especially bishops, had long perceived the ransoming of captives as a moral and holy act, even when it came at great expense to the church and its parishioners. Ecclesiastical and imperial legislation from the 5th and 6th centuries repeatedly flags the payment of ransom as one of the very few legitimate circumstances under which church property could be sold. But we should not assume that the church was always the original and only purchaser, if you will, in the process. As Honorius's law suggests, there seems to have been a booming ransom market in late antiquity, which supported a chain of buyers and sellers, linking the captive, their original captors, the barbarian vendors, who may or may not have been the same as their original captors, the family of the ransomed, ostensibly liable for the costs, and the churchmen, who are now charged to oversee the whole thing. Indeed, the ransom process itself is yet another phenomenon of fissure and fusion, wherein the displaced are required to break and make bonds with a range of differently interested parties. So to conclude this big section on categories, the late antique refugee clearly exists on the ground, but not as a legally defined person in the text, whereas the late antique captive is both intensely legally defined and a real disaster victim. While with these more theoretical distinctions in mind, I'd like to now, in the time that's left, perform something of a thought experiment with Procopius's digression on the Thessalians during the Gothic War, whereby I reconstruct some possible paths taken by the mother who abandoned her child. What sort of choices, if any, she had? What existing bonds might have helped or hindered? What new relationships did she need to form in order to survive? So let's start by remembering what Procopius tells us. And I'm just going to read the part in bold. When the army of Johannes, now a certain woman, let's just read it. So the army comes, and the section I want to read. So when a certain woman of this land had, as it happened, just given birth and had abandoned the infant in its swaddling clothes, lying upon the ground, and whether she fled or was captured by someone, she did not return. So this is all we know. She was there, she abandons the baby, and Procopius says whether she fled or was captured by someone, it's unclear, she didn't return. Now I see several possible paths for our displaced mother. First, she simply could have been killed during her attempt to flee the Roman army. Perhaps her death began and ended with the soldier, a Roman or Goth. It would have made a difference to her, stripping her body of any valuables, including her clothing. During disasters, we know that people stole from the dead and displaced, from their homes and even from their bodies. Back in the late 4th century, in the wake of Alaric's first path through northern Italy, Maximus of Turin, a bishop, reminded his congregants to think twice about the furniture and clothing they bought at rock bottom prices from barbarian vendors. Regard carefully the source, the owner of what is being sold and the price, and you will see that you are a partner in rapine and not a purchaser for something up for sale. Whence I ask, come these Roman properties? We know that they belong to the people of our province, citizens. Whether anyone bothered to bury her body is, of course, hard to say. The motif of too many dead to bury in disaster narratives obviously performed rhetorical labor, but it also reflects the fact that disasters temporarily disrupt normative practices, especially for those who've been socially detached, like our mother. Perhaps someone took pity on her and buried her in an unmarked grave, or in what the Greeks called pandektai, literally meaning all receiving spaces, and Syriac speakers called strangers' graves. And I won't butcher the Syriac, but if you want the terms, I have them. According to Maria Dörfler, these were burials for the destitute and social outsiders found in some East Mediterranean cities. As far as I know, we have no textual evidence for such stranger graves in Italy, but further attention to the archaeological and bioarchaeological record might help fill in some gaps. As Procopius surmised, the mother might have also run away, leaving behind forever. If she were a single female refugee, survival would have been challenging. She might have found someone willing to take her in as a dependent or client. A law issued by Valentinian III from Rome in 451, this is novella 31.5, considers an apparently common situation wherein Adweni strangers who are poor, and here I'm quoting, Adweni strangers who are poor and have lost fortune join themselves to the services of certain persons in order that, by pretending endurance of labor and servitude, they may receive food and clothing and thus escape the filth and squalor of want. This law, to be clear, has a male stranger in mind, and it by no means assumes a refugee either. That's also clear. It has a male stranger in mind, as it goes on to describe a scenario whereby a male Adwenus, a male stranger, marries one of the householders, the patrons, female Thai tenants, a colonna, has children with her, and then leaves just everybody since, quote, no law prohibits them. They're not from that place and they can legally go. They're not attached. As usual, the Roman state in this law, as elsewhere, is more concerned about fixing people in place than helping them on the move. But the situation at least raises the possibility that our mother became part of a household via a new set of dependencies, though perhaps now under the care of a more controlling landowner to whom her husband, theoretical husband, was legally obligated. So she married the colonists. Had our mother already been married or part of a male-headed family, especially one headed by a cleric, her path through displacement could have also ended with secure relocation. One thing is clear to me about displaced people in late antiquity: access to ecclesiastical networks mattered. Let me give you an example from late 5th century Gaul as a plausible parallel for 6th century Italy. And I think from that sort of areas of Clermont and Auxerre, the two cities I'm going to mention, so you can kind of see how far they are. In a short letter from the late 470s, addressed to Censorius, the bishop of Auxerre, Sidonius Apollinaris, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier, who by the time he was writing this letter was bishop of Clermont, makes case for the household of the deacon, whose name and church affiliation we are never told. This deacon, he writes, quote, was seeking an escape from the whirlwind of Gothic depredation with his family, and was carried into your territory by the very impetus of flight. Under circumstances not explained, the deacon and his family found their way onto a small plot of land owned by the Church of Auxerre, and from it was able to pull a small yield, a step, we might say, towards rebuilding their lives as displaced persons. However, the deacon's family nevertheless struggled to pay rent to the church. They clearly didn't make enough money off their land to pay the rent that they owed the church, which owned the land. Sidonius thus asks Censorius to regard the man as a, quote, household member of the faith and to forgive his debt and the rent for the year on these lands. Now, to a certain extent, traditional Roman social practice can explain why Sidonius took up the deacon's cause and helped him and his family weather displacement. For on a certain level, the letter is nothing more or less than a snapshot of a patron-client relationship, whereby a powerful man in one place attempts to pull strings for a less powerful in another. As studies of aristocratic refugees and captives show, elites fare better in displacement precisely because they have bigger networks, more friends, more patrons, more clients, etc., to help them resettle or return. The African aristocrat Calestiacus, for example, was able to make a life in Syria after the Vandal attack Carthage in 439, in large part because a leading bishop in Syria, Theodore of Epirus, wrote seven letters on his behalf. However, our Gallic deacon is no African senator or even a landowner. His path through displacement, therefore, seems to have relied on other factors in addition to traditional patronage. His identity as a cleric is one such factor. Presumably, the deacon came from somewhere near Clermont and was originally part of that diocese, meaning Sidonius had episcopal responsibility to assist him as a bishop. Perhaps he had lived on Sidonius's property, who was also a landowner, and was both the bishop's traditional client and his. Thus, had our mother been, so in other words, his clerical status, I think, matters, and it's why he can speak to the other bishop in Auxerre and ask him to take particular, pity, as it were, on this one person and help him out and look the other way through the rents for the year. Thus, had our mother been part of an ecclesiastical family, she could have found her way to another home on church property with a new bishop and landlord. The other thing I think this story is really interesting about the fact that they could not make ends meet. It's like they got there, they got a small farm, they grew some stuff, but they couldn't pay their rent. Also reminds us that working with a new landscape as an agriculturalist is not always easy. You can't just like pop someplace else. And these are in the same general area, but in two very different parts of France, with state France. They were also in two different kingdoms. There may well have been political issues at the moment. But the point is, I think we have to think about that too. You can all fine and nice to be brought someplace new, but you still have to know how to work that out. So I think that's interesting to think about too. Most horrifically, our fleeing mother could have been captured. While captivity counts as survival in some ways, it was arguably the worst possible scenario of displacement for anyone, including. It could last for days, months, or years. It could end relatively well with recovery of freedom, or tragically with permanent enslavement. As the details of Honorius' law of 408 shows, it could also mean something in between. 5 years of debt bondage to the person who ransomed you. Regardless, we must remember that captivity involved time with the captors, who in the case of our Ubersalian mother were likely Roman or Gothic soldiers. As a captive held in a camp, she may have been forced to take on to sort of into certain practices that were not her normal practice, and some of which might have been, nothing important, but some of them could have been hugely important. Like she might have been forced to eat sacrificial meat had her captors been pagan, which is unlikely in this case, but in other cases it was not. She might have been forced to participate in a different Christian theological community. Had her captors been Goths, they may well have been Samoans or Arians. And as a captive, and I say this because my evidence is this, after the Hunnic sack of Aquileia in 458, returned Roman captives reported these precise experiences. And we know this because their bishop had written to the Roman Pope at the time for advice on how to handle their re-entry into the city's Protestant church. So in other words, people in captivity are going to have to make very short-term choices about adapting to their captors' purpose. And the fact that our text in this case highlights religious adaptations, these are bishops writing to each other, but we can imagine other adaptations as well that could very much go against their ways of thinking of the world. I want to also say one quick thing too. I want to think more about this question because one of the big takeaways from Catherine Cameron's work, if anyone knows it, is the idea that when captives are brought to a new community, they actually bring their practices to that new community as well. So I think we also have to think about the ways in which captors bring the way they do things and teach their captors things that may become part of that community. So in other words, I think that that exchange can go both ways. The mother may well have also been raped. That's another very strong likelihood. And this is frequently mentioned in disaster narratives on the civilian, particularly on civilian impacts of war. As Kathy Gacka and Amy Richland have forcefully argued, the fact that rape is a common motif in literature doesn't mean that it wasn't also a grim reality. So that's one set of possibilities. Our captor could have then been sold. So the captor then decided to choose. They could have sold her on into slavery, whether directly to an owner or indirectly to a slave merchant, even though it was technically illegal. The line between captivity and enslavement was always a blurry one. In fact, the Greeks used the same word to denote the kidnapper and the slave trader, andropodist. But the line was likely even blurrier in a 6th century war zone like Italy, where adjudicating a dispute over status in court would have been especially challenging. Moreover, Hesiodorus, who's a writer living in Italy around the same time, actually at exactly the same time, tells us that there was an active slave market in southern Italy at the moment our Ubersalian mother was displaced. Nevertheless, her captors or initial purchasers would have had to weigh the pros and cons. Slaves on average fetched higher prices than ransomed persons, though women typically less than men, but to sell a freeborn woman into slavery was a capital crime. So you had to kind of wager what was the better bet. The safer, if less lucrative option was to ransom the captive, again, whether directly back to the family or to a third party. Ransom pricing varied wildly according to the social rank of the captive, while empresses and aristocrats fetched hundreds of solidi. Barbarian captives on a losing side could go for as little as 1 gold piece apiece. And there's a study by in French on pricing by Hervé Unziger, which suggests that about 10 solidi was probably average for a non-late. Now, solidus is a gold piece. It's the gold currency of Late Antiquity. However, even a single solidus, a single piece of gold coin, a single gold, was probably more than most people in their pockets, pushing us to ask some basic finance questions, starting with the source of funds. And just a little aside, this is something I'm just starting to really dig my teeth into, financing ransom. How does it work? So what is here is very preliminary, but I'm super interested. So people have ideas. Okay, several late Roman authors mention borrowing in the funding of ransom payments. Now, this is surprising, as sources from across the empire including ample pathological evidence attest to the frequency with which people loaned and borrowed to make ends meet. The late Roman economy was awash in moneylenders and informal credit institutions, and laws even fixed rates at 12% and then later under Justinian at 10%. So there was a market of buying, of loaning and borrowing, and there were interest rates. They were actually relatively low, well, depending on, I guess, how much money is, but they were theoretically fixed. Now, we get a glimpse of this banking system in relationship to captivity and ransoming in action from the 5th century historian Kristina, who describes how a Hunnic siege in around 450, the bishop of Sirmium, which is, you can see it on the map, it's all the way to the Danube, it's right basically in what is today, northern Greece, what is Serbia? It's in Serbia. It's in Serbia, yeah, today in what is Serbia. So we're still in Illyrium. So the bishop of Sirmium had given a man named Constantius gold bowls to use for the bishop's ransoms. Sirmium was being sieged. He gave these gold bowls to this man named Constantius, and he says, use these for my own ransom, or in the case of my death, for my parishioners. Constantius, we find out, leaves Sirmium to Rome, where he transacted the business with a banker named Silvanus, leaving him with the gold vessel as collateral. So Constantius brings the gold vessels, he gives them to Silvanus, Silvanus gives him some kind of coin. However, we then learn that Attila, executed Constantius. Constantius actually worked for Attila. He was a Roman who was sent to kind of work for Attila. This is Attila the Hun. There's really only one Attila. And that because Constantius dies, he's executed, Silvanus then doesn't get his repaid. So the loan goes unpaid. And then Silvanus went and sold off the gold vessels to some priests for silver. So we get this whole convoluted. And by the way, the story is told, by the way, because Attila wants the gold bowls back. He thinks they belong to him. And he is basically trying to force the Romans to find this Silvanus guy and bring them to Attila because Attila wants the gold. But the whole thing, right, starts with needing cash for ransom. And that's the important piece. The story suggests the existence of both an interregional borrowing system and something like risk assessment on the part of the bishop. It's like, oh, I might need this, better get some cash. Whether our mother's humble family could have tapped into this system is uncertain, but if they did, we need to consider how ransoming involved forming yet another indebted bond with moneylenders like Silvanus. So in other words, yet another dependency that gets created. Interestingly, Justinian, in the middle of the 6th century, passed a law requiring heirs to redeem captive family members, descendants, if they wanted to receive their inheritance, which suggests that people didn't want to do this, right? Like, I don't want to, I'm just going to keep my stuff and keep using the property. My dad's been taken, and I don't want to risk having to go borrow the money to get him back. And so what Justinian is trying to basically force people to do that by saying you don't get your inheritance legally unless you make good effort to redeem your family member. So in other words, people, again, trying to encourage people to ransom seems to be the state over again trying to do. Okay, while a family's motivation to pay ransom are perhaps obvious or not, those are third parties raise questions, and this is the last little piece before I conclude. What was it for them? Why would there be these like third party ransomers? Some may have thought to profit from charging a higher price than the original ransom. And we do have some evidence for profiteering in this respect. But I suspect that most became involved because a ransomed captive, unable to pay off her debt, was also a relatively long-term labor source. What kind of labor, you might ask? Well, probably domestic, maybe textile, but we know that sex work is another possibility. Again, despite the fact that it was technically illegal to prostitute a freeborn person. We know this was the fate of one man's daughter in the late 3rd century from a ruling handed down by Diocletian and Maximian. On a positive note, the emperor ruled that the family of the prostituted daughter, who apparently escaped her captor and got back to her father, no longer had to pay for the ransom. This is, by the way, why the case gets to court, because the woman who had ransomed, was a woman, by the way, who had ransomed this woman, this young girl, and was prostituting her, wanted, when the girl escaped, she wanted the father then to pay her back the ransom after she had been using her as labor for sex work. That's why we know about this. And the state ruled against her. They ruled in favor of the father and said, no, you do not have to pay back the ransom. And again, though, it reminds us how even though there were these laws, the ransomers could kind of play off the ignorance of these laws, or the fact that people didn't really understand what was going on. And there's a lot of other good evidence from legal sources when you look at the kind of cases behind them that suggest people are trying to take advantage of other people who don't necessarily know what is or is not legal. Okay, conclusions. At the start of this talk, and indeed as I began this project, I differentiated refugees from captives according to degrees of agency. I talked about voluntary versus involuntary. But as I've moved through the evidence in my argument, it's become clear to me that it's more accurate to distinguish them in terms of differing moods in chronologies, perhaps, of dependency. Few people choose displacement, however you conceptualize it, and even the captive has decisions to make that are hers and hers alone. A captive, for example, can decide to worship with Arian Christians because it was the path of least resistance in a camp run by Homoians. I think we get closer to understanding the experience of displacement in late antiquity when we pay attention to how and when it makes and unmakes hierarchical connections, whether with a predatory Good Samaritan, an unsympathetic episcopal landlord, a ransomer who pimps you out, or a moneylender who's lent you the coin to redeem your daughter. Finally, I hope this intensively syncretic, scaled-down examination of displacement and disaster has shed light not only on the social and structural possibilities and challenges of survival, but also on the costs of this survival to the individual, to reframe the dictum of disaster studies, resilience for whom. So, thank you.